Ian Henschke's in our Adelaide studio. Thanks very much for your time. Let's start with the review, because the government is indicating that it will be able to look at everything, including the superannuation rate, but that it's wedded to the current uptick already up to 12%. It doesn't really want to make any changes at all. Is that meaning it's sort of already essentially tying one of its arms behind its back on this?
Well, look, Tom, I think what we've got to look at is the way that all these things fit in together. One of the things we do know, and it's a very interesting figure to remember, is that 40% of older Australians at the moment, over 65, don't have any super. So we've got to, I think, educate Josh Frydenberg to that himself, because he said the other day that the deeming rate was set where it was because there was a suite of things that people could invest in. Now, if you have a look at that, we know that there are a lot of people out there that haven't got super. They didn't get it during their working life, and they're now retired, and of course that's an issue. And then you've got people at the moment who are in and out of the workforce who don't get super as well, or don't get the same amount as super. You've got people also that are working for themselves that don't have super. So I think he should have everything on the table, and he should look at the way the whole thing fits together in a sort of ecosystem. Like at National Seniors, we like to say there's an ecosystem with the emphasis on economics of the system, because you've got a group of people coming through to retirement age, which is being pushed out. Just the other day, it was pushed out to 66. And Scott Morrison was at one stage talking about pushing it out to 70. He ruled that out. That was last year. And so you've got a whole lot of factors there. And what we want is an independent view of how we do retirement. And so I'd like to see this not to be about ideological warriors having a go at each other, but a real opportunity for Josh Frydenberg and also the opposition and all the other parties to look together at how we set up Australia for the next 40 years, not the next 4 years.
So one of the big parts of retirement, one of the big indicators on whether you have a pretty comfortable one or otherwise, appears to be whether you own your own home. Now, we know that rate is falling, and the pension is set, so it's supposed to take that into account. But I think just about everyone would assume that even with the different pension rate, a higher one if you don't own your own home, you're better off. Does that need to be looked at? You know, when this has been set in the past, is it assumed that renting is a bit easier, a bit cheaper than it is now?
Oh, well, look, Tom, if you think about the way that things were set up in the past, I mean, if you go back 20 years or so, probably 90% of Australians would have owned their own home by the time they retired, and the others would have been, who were on a pension, would have been in some form of public housing, which was probably rent-controlled in some way. We now have a situation where all over Australia, public housing has been let down in a sense that it's been de-invested, and we've actually got now people who are in poverty in their pension years. 1 in 3 older Australian women who are on the pension are living in poverty. 1 in 4 overall are living in poverty. So we haven't done it very well. And the biggest predictor of pension poverty is whether or not you own your own home. And now that is the big key to it. And you're right on the money there, Tom. If they do not factor that into this retirement income review, then in fact it's not really a proper review. This should not be some sort of ideological war between the parties. This needs to be a coming together of all the parties and actually saying, how can we do retirement incomes better? And there's some great minds out there. Michael Rice is holding an event in Canberra, Rice Warner Group. He was the Actuary of the Year, and for those that don't know what an actuary does, they're a person who looks at numbers, and those numbers are telling him a lot of things about retirement. Have a look at this figure, Tom. Every week in Australia, 1,000 people turn 80. We've got 5.5 million baby boomers. We've got 8.5 million people over the age of 50. So if this government doesn't look at what's going on, they are going to have big problems, because they're going to have people living in poverty. And we're already seeing the gap between the rich and the poor widening.
Right. The other big number here, you were talking about there, the retirement age of 67. There are a few things going on here. Obviously, Australians are living longer. The government wants incentive to keep people working who can. A lot of these people want to, well beyond 67. Some people can't. How do you harmonise that?
Well, I also take issue with the fact that people are living longer, because there's some evidence now to suggest that we've reached what you would call peak ageing, and people are only living longer because they're on pills or because they've got a series of health issues that are being controlled by medical
science. But people have been living longer for a long time, particularly the last time this age was set, if you go back 40, 50 years. So that point remains.
Yes. Well, no, look, there's a whole range of statistics that you can roll out, but once you reach 65, it hasn't pushed out a heck of a lot since, say, 20 years ago. We're talking about a couple of years, for example, and they've adjusted the pension by a couple of years, so that shouldn't be the issue. What we need to be looking at is how all these things fit together. So what we're saying is we need an independent review of, A, the adequacy of the pension, an independent review of deeming rates for those people that have saved during their life and they're being punished. They're having their pockets and their passbooks pinched by the government at the moment, and we are not giving in on that. That adjustment was made the other day was just a partial adjustment for what had gone on and had not been adjusted for the last 4 years. So national seniors will continue to fight over deeming rates. We are also going to continue to fight over Newstart because we've got 173,000 Australians between 55 and 64 who are, in fact, chewing up their savings, chewing up their superannuation as they head towards pension age. So if you look at all these things together... Can I ask you about
that? Scott Morrison has indicated through the week that his priority would be to increase the pension before Newstart because there's not an endless pot of money here. What do you make of that priority?
Well, I think he really does have to sit down and think how they fit together because he's going to have to increase the amount of money he's got for the pension anyway, because if you're between 55 and 64 and the average length of time that you spend on Newstart is 4 years, these are the figures that can be provided to him by the Bureau of Statistics. These can be provided to him by the Department of Employment. I mean, the average length of time for a person between 55 and 64 who is on Newstart is 190 weeks. So when they finally do get to pension age, he's going to have to pay them a full pension, not a part pension. So it's false economics to ignore this. I mean, I really wonder, Josh Frydenberg went to Oxford. I think he understood when he was at Oxford that you get a one-on-one tutorial from an expert. I think he needs to go and talk to the experts in other countries and in this country. Michael Rice, Professor Deborah Ralston, Professor Claassen from Canada. These people have actually got insight into it. He needs to go and talk to the experts, get an independent assessment of what he should be doing and not conduct some sort of ideological war either on people on Newstart or saying that these people on the pension have got a certain rate of deeming that they should be getting from their investment accounts. They need to understand the minds of older Australians.
A lot of these calls, Ian Henschke, that you're making here, all of them come down to, at the end, cost, don't they? All of these ideas you've got and you're talking about and are going to cost billions of dollars. What are we talking about annually?
Do you know
what happens to the surplus if they're all implemented?
Do you know what happens as well? What happens to the lives of ordinary Australians? What happens to the lives of the people in this country who are languishing on Newstart between 55 and 64? I was discussing this the other day on Sydney radio. One of the first callers that rang in said that he'd suicided. What's the cost of suicide? What's the cost of heartbreak? What's the cost of marriage breakdown? What's the cost of unemployment? Let's start thinking about that. If you can find $158 billion in tax cuts, I think you can find $2 billion to get rid of the home care waiting list. I think you can find a few $1 billion to give people on Newstart something that's better.
What would you say your ideas add up to in an annual cost for the changes you're calling for?
That's why I'm saying, look, I can tell you that we are talking billions of dollars in doing this, but we are also talking about $158 billion.
20?
That's just... OK. Let's take the home care wait list, which is an issue that's out there at the moment. The Royal Commission has already had a figure, $2 to $2.5 billion. Miss Fiona Buffington from the department has told the government that's what it's required to fix the home care wait list, right? Now, we know that we have got the deeming issue that's out there at the moment. There are 1 million Australians who have been deemed to be earning a certain amount of money.
I'm not trying to ignore that issue, but we are nearly out of time, Ian Henschke. I'm just trying to get an idea. Have you toted up these ideas?
Do you want
the various policies you want around a Newstart increase if pension was better, if deeming rates were what you wanted them to be, if the waiting list for aged care was removed as well? Do you have a rough ballpark figure for what you're talking as an annual cost?
I'm going to tell you something now, Tom, that will surprise you. If you keep someone at home and they don't go into an aged care home, that saves the money for the government. If you give someone a reasonable amount of money when they're on Newstart, they may not develop a whole range of problems that cost the government money. This is why you need to have a cost-benefit analysis.
There's clearly a cost to increasing Newstart in an overall sense.
Well, you can actually have a look at that and say, well, what is it costing the community to have 173,000 55 to 64-year-olds at the moment languishing for 4 years before they retire? Because I'll go back to that figure again.
Right.
If they chew up their savings and chew up their superannuation, they're going to be on full pensions, not part pensions. So where's the cost saving? Where is the cost saving?
Right.
This is why you have to have an independent person. We need an independent person to have a look at it, because these politicians don't understand what's going on and they need help.